Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Arth, and I work with ACPA, College Student Educators International. Just want to let everyone know that we will be starting this webinar in just about 5 minutes. Thank you very much, and we'll be back on in about 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Arth, and I'm with ACPA, College Student Educators International. I wanted to let you know that today's online learning event will be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Tim Arth, and I'm with ACPA, College Student Educators International. We wanted to welcome you to today's online learning event, Finding Community, Narratives of Disability and Race. Before we go ahead and bring the panelists and moderator up here to present, we wanted to let you know about some of the capabilities of the Shindig online learning platform that we're utilizing today. This online learning webinar is being brought to you by Shindig. In the Shindig platform, you have the opportunity to join with other people in the room to engage in dialogue during the presentation. In addition to that, you'll have the opportunity throughout the presentation to submit any questions that you might have, and then we'll direct those to the moderator and panelists to answer during the presentation as well. In addition to that, we do have captioning available for today, so you'll be able to select that through the widget in your profile as well. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me an IM. My name is Tim Arth during the presentation. I'll be happy to assist you with any technical needs. So we'll go ahead and get this webinar started.
And thank you for joining us today for the Finding Community, Narratives of Disability and Race. My name is Dr. Clint Michael Renaud, and I am the Associate Vice President at California State University, Fullerton, and I'll serve as the moderator today. Following the release, implementation, and further development of the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization, the Coalition for Multicultural Affairs and the Coalition for Disability are excited to convene a virtual panel of the experiences of people of color with a disability and how their narratives can inform implementation of the strategic imperative and ultimately transform student affairs practice. In dialogue today and in shared community of their experiences, navigating both racial identity and disability, panelists will illuminate the mutual nature of racial and disability justice, as well as prompt reflection and action in line with the strategic imperative and the call for racial and disability justice through our student affairs practice. One of the reasons we have the need to be in conversation around this today is to understand how can we interrogate and illuminate the ways that racism and ableism interact to generate unique forms of inequality and resistance. If you recall the tragedy around Eric Garner, once that happened, a Republican representative stated, "You have a 350-pound person who was resisting arrest. The police were trying to bring him down as quickly as possible," said Representative Peter King. "If he had not had asthma and had a heart condition and was so obese, almost definitely he would not have died." Ladies and gentlemen, that is ultimately the call to action around the need to have conversations around racism and the failure of law enforcement to understand and to accommodate disability. And so our conversation today really hopes to spark some of these inquiries and see how, as student affairs professionals, and how those of us in this field can shed light on this topic and see the connection of all of this. I'd like to take this time to introduce our panelists today. We're going to start by having the panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Erica.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Eastep, and I work at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Thank you to ACPA for allowing me this platform. To me, it's long overdue, but at the same time, I believe that it's a good time in our profession to begin to bring awareness to this issue. In many ways, it's being personal to me. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I've been in the field for about 20 years. And so the reason that I've chosen to come forward is because I really wanted to add my voice to the conversation as a unique voice, and also to tell my own narrative instead of having others to tell it for me. So today you'll hear my counter narrative that hopefully will resonate with many. And then also my identities, and I realize that people have multiple dimensions to their identities, and so that's why this topic is so important. And ACPA's strategic imperative on decolonization and racial justice really resonated with me. So thank you for having me and listening to my story today.
Thank you, Erica. To mention, I use he, him, and his pronouns. I would like to now move to Zainab, and Zainab will provide the introductions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab Samantwala. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I serve as the Global Diversity Program Coordinator within Student Diversity and Social Justice at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. My interest in joining this particular discussion today largely stems from the identities that I hold. I identify as Asian and blind. And for me, this is a conversation I think that has been waiting to happen. A lot of my research when I was in grad school, it often felt very much that the voice of people of color was missing when talking about disability. And so to be sitting here and to be able to have this conversation with everyone is very exciting for me.
Thank you. Now can we have Kevin please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Wright. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I serve as the Black African American Program Coordinator in the Office of Student Diversity and Social Justice at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I'm definitely glad to be here today because I identify as a cis heterosexual Black male who is half blind with a learning disability. And I definitely think that disability gets overlooked from time to time when it comes to social justice spaces, as well as diversity and multiculturalism spaces. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation today.
Thank you, Kevin. I believe we have one more panelist, and we're going to see if the technology is on our side today. We're going to see if Trixie is available for an introduction. Okay, we'll come back to Trixie if possible with the technology. I want to begin by asking a question for the panel. What are some of the prominent experiences of navigating disability and race that you've had? So what are some of the prominent experiences of navigating race and disability? Would anybody like to take that first?
I can go ahead. Something that really just comes to mind is being overlooked constantly. It's one of those things where, as I said before, I feel as though that disability doesn't get talked about in certain spaces as much as it should. There have been some issues of racial elitism that I have experienced. So it's like, because I am not completely able-bodied and completely of good sounding mind as a Black male, there have been times where I've not been openly welcomed either within the Black community, quote unquote, like a smaller subset of that, or within spaces of my work community or my family community. And it's one of those things where it's been difficult to address that, but nonetheless, I know that it's worth it because my silence won't protect me. And then it sometimes feels as though that I have to navigate through spaces where I have to constantly prove myself in light of the fact that I have a disability. And it's one of those things where at first it was like one of my biggest motivators, but then I realized that it shouldn't have to be that way, which is why I try to engage in more conversations and try to read up on more research that aligns with disability justice.
Thank you, Kevin. Would you like to add?
Sorry. Yeah, I think for me, similar to Kevin, it's the feeling of being overlooked. But I think, especially for me, it's always been, I have to choose. Do I get to be, like, I have to choose between being a person with a disability and being a person who is Asian and being a woman. And it's like, there are moments where I'm like, why can't I be all of these things and that be okay? I think I've especially noticed this sometimes within my own family system, where it's like, my parents still struggle, I think, to a degree with having two blind daughters. I love my mother, but there are moments where she says certain things. I'm like, Mom, that's not okay. And so it's a mix of having to choose or being forced to choose. And sometimes also the other struggle is also being forced to be the educator all the time.
Right. Thank you. Erica, would you like to add anything?
Yes. So I will say that my ability is based on it's invisible, ability. And so that's why I asked the other panelists to go first, because in many ways, this is truly the first time in an open forum that I'm having a conversation about being a woman of color with a disability. Because in some ways, I would say that I've been passing in the workplace. So when you ask the question about how to navigate that, it has been an ongoing journey that I'm still navigating. There have been various moments of, in many ways, feeling closeted, that I couldn't come out to talk about my disability, nor in some ways was it even relevant. I recognize, as you talk about salient identities, that when I show up in a room, I show up as an able-bodied woman, a Black woman, and I am cisgender. And so there's so many different ways that the intersections of my identities merge. But internally, in the world in which I fully live, there is definitely an invisible world in which I live, and there's people who join that invisible world in some ways that I choose to. So it's been quite difficult to navigate those. Having families in many ways, culturally, I think I can speak in general for the Black community that naming your disability has been a challenge to embrace the fact that you once again have yet something else that people can oppress you as. So I recognize the rationale behind that, and being a part of another marginalized, well, actually two marginalized groups, from women to being a Black woman. So I'm glad that with Kimberly Crenshaw, and even as dated back to Anna Julia Cooper, really bringing light to the ways in which Black women's stories can exist, and telling your own story. So for me, now that being in the field for 20 years, um, I have even had the challenge of, how do I bring to light and advocate for those spaces, and to really train others in many ways on how to deal with people with disabilities, and to fully understand that and reflect on it for myself, as someone who in many ways in the workforce, I would say I was passing in many ways. Sometimes I recognize that ways in which my disability had me to navigate certain spaces was quite challenging, whether it was in my graduate program, or based on different workloads that I had, and um, how to develop the necessary tools that I needed in order to succeed in a work environment. So that has been the most challenging, and it's why it has become even more of a salient identity for me, now that I have begun to recognize the challenges that exist for others.
Thank you. So each of you brought up different points around choosing, having to choose which identity you approach. And also, some of you talked about being a constant educator. You mentioned things like naming and being a part of another marginalized group, having another form of oppression on you. What about what identities and in what spaces within our work and within the field, where is race more salient to you? And then I would like for you to think about what are spaces in which your disability status, your ability status is more salient for you as you enter into those spaces. Whoever would like to start.
Okay, I will begin. I believe I spoke on it a little in my last comment, but without being too deep in this scenario, because I've been reading a lot on the decolonization, and the fact that recognizing that the American college system is really deep rooted in colonization. And so I don't think that there's ever a time that my race is not salient.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, race was also seen as a disability in many ways. in terms of just not being considered human. And I think I believe that there's a lot of that still permeates in terms of intellectual ability and capability, and how people even now, even K through 12, and how we enter into college spaces and how we're seen. So for me, my race has always been the most salient identity. Um, what I would say is that in many ways, my level of ability showed itself when I no longer could manage it. It forced me to really come out of hiding, if you will, to really deal with how it was manifesting itself as I aged as well. So it's now probably salient, but I don't think it's salient because people notice it or know to call it that. And so I also recognize my privilege, and my privilege being able to do that. And I recognize also the power that lies in that and the different power dynamics that rest there. So for me, choosing whether or not for my ability to be salient is definitely an act of my privilege and power that rests there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Zainab or Kevin, do either of you have anything you'd like to add?
Okay, so I think for me as a student, typically it really was my identity as a student with a disability that felt the most salient. To be more specific, I often felt like I was behind, even at the starting point. So good example, classes are starting at the beginning of the semester, and while all of my classmates have their textbooks and their readings, I'm still waiting to receive an accessible version that I can read and work through, right? So definitely that situation as a student. And also, and I kind of touched on this previously, right? That feeling of having to choose. More often than not, it has been my identity as a person with a disability that's more salient, because I don't get to interact with, I feel like it's missing. And when I say it, what I mean specifically kind of talking about Asian people, Asian women, South Asian women at that, right? Like, where is that narrative, and why don't I see it more often? To find mentors who identify with this particular intersection, those mentors currently are one or the other. They're either a person with a disability or a person who is Asian, or a person who or a woman of color. So for me, it's sort of that lacking intersection. But generally speaking, my identity as a person with a disability feels more salient because I think that's what people see of me first. They see the white cane before they see the color of my skin.
Thank you. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I'm all good. The other panelists covered it all, and I don't want to be redundant. So thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, and I want to also remind the audience, if you have any questions you would like to ask the panelists, please feel free. You can provide us your questions by typing them in, and they will be submitted to us. But what I wanted to ask was around the experiences in the workplace. How have those experiences shown up for you with regard to your race and disability? Have you seen experiences that have been intertwined? Or have you had experiences where you think they were different, but that they showed up in the workplace as well? Erica, you mentioned talking about your disability status when it started showing up and you had to manage it, right? And that's when it became more salient for you in the workplace. You said you always identified as a woman of color, which in some ways people, based on oppression and systemic, racism, treated as a disability to you. But you said that when your disability status starts showing up as your invisible disability, you had to start managing that. Do you mind walking us through what that experience was like for you, or what some of those experiences were?
Well, I will say
I think
during this panel, oops, okay.
you're good, you're good.
Okay. Um, well, I will say that having to prepare for this panel really kind of dug up a lot of things. I think people experience a lot of work hurt. And I know that I've suppressed mine a lot. Um, in many ways, it caused my career, in my opinion, to be derailed. Um, although I know everyone has their own path to walk. But because I didn't really deal with my come to terms with the fact that I had a disability, really may have harmed me in more ways than not. And so I will say that really it began, I would say mainly like in graduate school, and then once I entered into the profession and recognized um, how really being in the work environment and having the demands that it is, and also that many of our work environments were not and still aren't accessible. Even structurally, people's understanding of disabilities, people's assumptions about what people know, what they can handle. It's still very, very even, for example, showing my face on this webinar was a choice that I had to make because it's not something that I have shared or need to share with my employers. But I do think that for me, like I said, it's been a journey. One of the things that I began to notice is that the level of workload. I started off in housing and residence life. And so it's one of those positions where you live where you work. And so I was never in a place where I was off, so to speak, and having to learn. I also didn't realize or see that disability services was for me. And I know that seems weird to some, but I didn't think that it was a space for me. I felt that it was always for those who had physical disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so also just not being able to understand where those resources are. So it was painful. It was a very painful experience. Very painful.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Kevin, do you have any experiences of this showing up in the workplace?
Yes. The biggest example that comes to mind is that I'm aware of the fact that I am a cisgender heterosexual Black male, and there is this unfortunate narrative that that Black men are not showing up. They are being complacent. They are not supporting Black women. They are homophobic. They are transphobic, and I'm aware of that. I'm doing all that I can to not perpetuate that. And something that sometimes happens is when I'm in a meeting space or some type of workspace, there have been times where I have been silent, and it's because I'm still processing. I'm still trying to figure out how can I articulate my point to support this. And sometimes people have called me out and have said, Kevin, you're being complacent. It's just like, well, I'm not trying to. I'm just processing slower than you because of my learning disability. Mm-hmm. And it does get frustrating to constantly explain myself. And sometimes it feels even more frustrating to accommodate other folks who may not have a disability, either visible or invisible, because I choose to or because I want to, when many folks have a hard time accommodating me, and it's the law. It's also very frustrating knowing that sometimes I have to coddle people's guilt because of the fact that they didn't know prior to me disclosing that I have a disability that it is hard for me sometimes. So it's like I know the work and the value that I put and contribute to this field, and even then sometimes it gets overlooked because of the fact that I'm not immediately putting in action when it's like, I know that I want to do this work and I know that I want to show up in spaces where Black men usually don't show up, and it's just hard sometimes. But I'm not trying to use my disability as an excuse. I just wish that other folks would understand and actually acknowledge that, because it even says it in the guiding document of the strategic imperative to authentically build relationships and do this work out of responsibility, not out of compliance. So I would love it for folks to actually accommodate folks with people with disabilities, because because they want to, not because they have to be compliant and so they don't get sued. Furthermore, how can I authentically develop a relationship with you if you can't authentically acknowledge your discomfort with my disability? And, it kind of ties back to like what Erica said. And Erica, I really do appreciate you for like showing up in this space and, showing that vulnerability, because I know it's not easy. And I definitely do appreciate your sentiment. And that's why I think people really need to focus more on the humanization piece that is also outlined in the guiding document of the strategic imperative. We talk about humanization, yet sometimes it feels as though we only humanize certain identities of a person and not the whole person.
Right. Absolutely. I echo what you say, because many times what we see with power and privilege dynamics, people who aren't willing to check power or to really do the work around privileged identities show up in spaces and feel like it's in a sense, for a lack of better words, kind of a show and tell. I mean, they want to know, you have to educate them about what's happening with you. They want to put you on the spot. I was in a meeting at one point with a colleague who utilizes a wheelchair, and another colleague who was above her in title and status asked her during the committee meeting, "How do you use the restroom? I've always been so curious how you use the restroom." And it's like it's mind-blowing that that someone doesn't understand the level of absurdity that is wrapped in power and privilege within that question, and to do it as if this is and I had to I tried to do it with some finesse, but I ended up having to in some ways go off on the person, because it's like, are you serious right now? Is this what you're doing? But I also want to say, Erica, thank you. I know that people carry, those are things that cause trauma. That's trauma causing, and we carry that with us. And so I appreciate Kevin, how you talked about because you're processing it and you process differently, that doesn't mean you're not showing up. It means that you're taking it in and you're processing. So I appreciate that. Zainab, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Mm-hmm. So I'm aware statistically that a majority of people with disabilities don't have master's degrees. It's growing, right? Having higher degrees, and to that end, also, I think employment is still a huge issue for people with disabilities. So to know that I am in a full-time, 40-hour-a-week position with a master's degree, that's a lot of pressure, right? I feel like I have to be perfect. And then there are moments where I'm struggling because my parents are immigrants. They immigrated here. I was born here, but I'm still in the role of the good Indian daughter, right? And so to balance often what is a lack of boundaries within my family system, and to balance the pressure of feeling like I'm being scrutinized, that if I mess up at all, it's going to not just affect me, but it's going to affect people's perception of, are people with disabilities hireable? Like, is it work? Like, will they be able to do the job, or are there too many things, right? I don't want that, and yet I carry that. Right. And so for me, that's a lot of times what I'm thinking about in terms of what am I like at work. I feel the need to be perfect. And so when I mess up, if I make a mistake, I often feel like I don't have room to make a mistake, even though my supervisor is wonderful and will reassure me and say, no, that's okay. You are allowed to. And yet it's something I'm still struggling with, right? How do I navigate that piece of being able, that it's okay to make a mistake, and that the perception of an entire community is not on me.
Right.
So that's something that I have been thinking about with this particular question.
So that brings up a lot about just what and how do you define success and achievement in a work environment, and how how are you thinking that, you have these internal high expectations of oneself that maybe everyone might have as a professional, but then it's also balancing with, not wanting to feel limited by your ability, not wanting to made to feel limited by your ability, and also trying to determine what does success look like in the normal work environment, but also for me. And so there's a lot of things around what does that achievement or how success looks like for you, and are you meeting expectations, or are people lowering their expectations once they are aware of your ability, or are they feeling that you don't meet expectations, and then you have to decide, particularly those who are dealing with disabilities that are not always seen. I just recall a family member who was completely deaf in one ear, and they lived their entire life, no one ever knowing that they were hard of hearing. And just imagining what that was like to live a life where we were just in spaces that I knew that they were hard of hearing, but I saw them navigating their bodies just to be able to hear, but not able to actually say, this is a challenge for me. Something else that I wanted to bring up is, the conversation here today is really merging and blending ableism and racism together, and what is that intersection of those and the multidimensional ways that all of those identities play. And I think that what's so powerful in that is that if you're a part of multiple communities that have been oppressed, and so systematically that it's so in depth in ways that you haven't fully unpacked it. You may not even recognize how you've internalized that oppression. And so to then, on top of it, having to deal with insider, outsider, with family, with work, with your own personal life, it can be so overwhelming that we're expecting the person who is carrying that to now educate and to say, here is what I need, but you may not be at a place, as I wasn't earlier on in my career and in my life, to even come to terms with that I was a person with a certain ability status. And so I hadn't even unpacked it for myself, let alone being able to advocate for myself in a workspace. And so my plight now is to really say, how do we develop work environments where, whether you have people of color on your work, on your staff or not, how do you create an environment that is inclusive? Whether you have someone who has a physical or invisible disability, what are the ways in which we set environments and culture, a work culture that says all are welcome, and so that we can again have people who don't have to necessarily fully advocate because it's already there.
Erica, thank you for that. That's a great segue into the next question by one of our audience members. And the question reads, we talk a lot about race in the workplace, but we talk less about ability. What would you like your supervisors and your coworkers to know about creating inclusive experiences and environments with ability status in mind? Zainab, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm actually still thinking. I'm still processing the question. I think there are ways to be proactive about this. Using just my experience, right? I appreciate my supervisor a lot because she has been very proactive about making sure that I have what I need in order to be successful as a person with a disability. And simply being accepting of the fact that there are some days where it's like, you know what, I just can't see that. That's not working. And accepting it at face value, right? I think this is also where we talk a lot or at least not we, but I feel like when you look at research around students with disabilities, teaching students how to advocate for themselves comes up as a pretty common theme. And we, I think as professionals with disabilities have to continually do the same. But I think is so important to have colleagues and peers and supervisors and administrators on higher levels who are thinking about that as well. So knowing that, okay, within our division, we know we have at least 2 people with disabilities. What can we do as able-bodied folks so that they don't have to think about coming to us with what they need? We're automatically doing it. I think having that mindset is something I would love to see just be broadly applicable to this field. And I think that's something we should be thinking about.
Thank you, Zainab. Kevin or Erica, do you have any thoughts?
I was just gonna say that as much as I want to like further advance my colleagues, supervisors, and coworkers on disability justice, I find myself personally still just trying to get folks to understand like the basic foundations of ADA accessibility and ADA accommodations. There have been times where I've even attended a campus event, and it was like a ballroom space, and there were tables that were spaced out maybe like 1.5 feet away from each other. It's just like, how is this accessible for somebody that's walking with a cane or that is navigating in a wheelchair? It's one of those things where even just like thinking about that, just think about like how you create those spaces that should be accessible. And if you know that your space is inaccessible, what are you doing to try to like change that or fix that, or at least inform people about that? So as much as I want to, be on letter Q right now, I'm still starting with the ABCs of ADA accessibility. I'm just being honest. So it's one of those things where I would say start with the basics, read the imperative, read scholars that have wrote about and published scholarship on disability justice, and then have that be at the forefront of some of your conversations in your staff meetings. Because again, some people think that, all I have to do is just put this blue and white logo on a flyer, and then therefore I'm compliant. And again, as the strategic imperative says, we should be doing this work because it is our responsibility, not because we just simply want to be compliant.
Thank you.
I snaps to you both. I think we really are, as a profession, at the very beginning. I mean, we still have our campus environment and buildings that are just not accessible. We have, some of us might even list a clause that says if you need accommodations, some spaces still we're not there. And so to get back to the actual question, I was pausing and really thinking that yes, we may talk about race in the workplace more in some spaces than ability, but I think at different times, particularly around the laws Kevin mentioned, we may have spaces that we talk about that. But in terms of just looking at it from a binary standpoint, I recognize maybe what you meant in the question, but I do think that we have to begin to look at how do we dismantle the interlocking systematic oppressions that exist without having to separate that. Yet I do understand that we may have more of diversity being a value or inclusivity, but inclusion also includes everyone in all parts of themselves. So as far as just talking about abilities, it just has to be the education of, it has to be thinking about something, as Kevin mentioned, about we don't have to see someone in a wheelchair to create the space that is needed in the event of someone coming, because you don't know. That's the thing about, as I represent someone with invisible disability, it's, are things done in a way, like, for example, I encourage the team. We didn't know if we would have any students that with a hearing or visual impairment, but that didn't mean that we didn't have to have, that we shouldn't have interpreters there, or, so those kinds of steps in the work environment, beginning to ask people about their learning style when you're trying to do trainings or where you're inviting people. So it does begin with developing the one-on-one relationship, but also looking at organizationally, what can you do? I do recognize that things are budget decisions, but are you projecting things so that, yes, we can now get all of our residence halls to be accessible in some way? So I think that we just need to begin to have the conversation, but because we know that it's really systemically designed, that we also have to get to the root of how we as an organization can then make changes regardless of the people in which that we may see or know on our staff that have a disability.
And I know I'm not on the panel, but I am going to jump in because I wanted to give you some snaps to all of you as well.
Yeah.
But I will say that we have to remember that whiteness and able-bodiedness perpetuate everything. And if you're not, and I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we putting on the backs of individuals, whether it's individuals of color or individuals with disabilities? What are we placing on the backs of these individuals to teach folks, show folks, design for folks, model for folks who are very comfortable within their own privileged existence, right? And so why are we placing it on the backs of these individuals without understanding how, again, going back to issues of power and privilege, how we are either aware or very unaware, people walking through an existence of choosing not to be aware. And then we have a panelist who is not able to join us today. Our panelist named Trixie wanted to remind everyone that folks have a responsibility to understand your own ableist behavior, right? You have your own responsibility. Everyone in every department, in every division of student affairs, has a responsibility to address and examine the bias that we carry and the ableist behavior that we exhibit. That's there. It's there. And so we need to address that rather than placing it on the backs of other individuals to teach folks around this type of thing. So that's one piece I wanted to add. I wanted to go back to the conversation that Zainab, you raised a point that you talked about as a South Asian woman, that you felt you had a representation piece of representing the community. Kevin, you talked about you wanting to be, you identifying as a cis Black male who wants to show up in spaces that oftentimes people don't think you would normally show up in, and that kind of thing. We talked about the idea of representation and having to carry a sense of carrying this for the community piece. What does that really do to an individual in terms of how does success look like in this field? How do you think success can show up in the field for you based on being a person of color and with a disability? And then how do we, so number one is, what does success look like? And number two, what needs to happen to further the conversation in spaces that this conversation isn't happening? Was that a lot for this early in the morning?
What does success look like?
What does success look like for our field? Is that what you mean?
So I would say, is there a way that you can hold both, right? You represent yourself as a woman of color and as someone with a disability. In your role now, what does success look like carrying those identities? Because we've talked about the sense of carrying the things that we all carry, right? You talk about that you carry around trying to be the model daughter. Zainab, you talked about being the daughter that your parents need, and that the representation for Southeast Asian women. Kevin, you talked about being a man of color who shows up. So how do we? Is there a way that makes? Is there a way to do this successfully in the work that we do? And then how do we need to further this conversation?
I think I can only say my story. But at the same time, when you mention representation, I think this is an example of a success. I think that having the platform to actually hear the narratives of people who have these interlocking identities, to have a platform to speak. For me, this is success personally, as I've come out of sort of my hidden world and recognize that I did need to stand in places where others, for various reasons, are not, and recognizing the privilege in doing so because of where I am in my life. I think success would also look like our student affairs and higher education preparatory programs. That's probably a next step as well. I think when scholarship merges with practice, there's a growing field of discrit where they're really looking at disability and race in a very critical way. And so how do we, for those scholars who are really thinking about these, merge with the practice? I think success would look like continuing the conversation versus just a trend. And I think success would be when ultimately everyone feels like they can be in spaces and truly show up as their authentic self, and that we're prepared for them. Not only prepared as for our students, but also prepared for the staff in which are serving the students.
All right. Thank you. Zainab or Kevin, do you have any reactions or thoughts to that?
Erica summed it up pretty well, to be honest.
Okay. So I want to ask you this question. Erica, you mentioned earlier that your disability is invisible. And so in a sense, you said that you had to start recognizing it and addressing it at work once you had to start managing it. So in some ways it was like coming out. You said you passed, in terms like covering, that kind of thing. Zainab, you mentioned a white cane. People see a white cane before they see you as a woman of color. What I want to ask now, what is it? Why do individuals disclose or choose not to disclose their disability status in the workplace? What do you think comes up with that? Some of your thoughts around that?
So I can go ahead and answer this question first. There's a lot of stigma around being a blind person, specifically. Mm-hmm. I believe there have been numerous polls and studies that have done where a lot of times when the general populace is asked, like, if you were to lose one of your senses, which would be like the worst that you would not be able to handle if you lost it, a lot of people answer sight. So bearing that in mind, for me, I think I don't choose to disclose in any sort of hiring materials when I'm in a job search until it's absolutely necessary, because the last thing I want people to do is to create some sort of perception of me based solely on my ability status. I know what I'm capable of. I know what I can do. And I stand very firmly by the let my work speak for itself before we bring in this other piece of, and I did all of that as a person who's blind, right? I don't, that doesn't need to be a part of the conversation until it's absolutely necessary. So that is why I personally choose not to disclose until I have to.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? I know, Erica, you mentioned even showing your, choosing to show your face today with the camera was a choice you had to make. Do any of you have any further comments about the choice you chose today in showing up for this?
Erica, did you want to go first? If not.
Sure. I'll just making sure I'll share the space. Yeah, I don't think that I've even shared an identity status in a broad way in my work environment. I know that I have not. I have perhaps in workshops, but this is definitely the first more national platform, I guess, or large platform. And some of that, again, I recognize there's privilege in that. I have learned in many ways, somewhat, as I mentioned earlier, painfully, to manage it behind the scenes. I have disclosed to past and former supervisors and at least one colleague, more so just because part of it is because when you're having to do certain work, sometimes people notice certain things, and then I begin to notice that, okay, maybe I need to share something that's needed, but I never share necessarily like this is my disability. And so I agree with what others have said, and maybe it's the obvious, but there is beyond, I don't even know if there's a word beyond stigma that is attached. I know that I haven't even checked, the box when they say, oh, it's not attached to your application. What happens when people ask for accommodations, even for an interview? What does that look like? And so I think that has to be a person's, an individual choice. But my decision of disclosing is because in some ways, someone was a trailblazer for me in various identities that I hold. And so that, not that I necessarily consider myself a trailblazer, but I feel like there has to be some representation for voices that are just not heard. And so that was my own decision. But disclosing is something that I've consistently had as a journey, and definitely as a need to know basis. But I have been reflecting on how have I limited my opportunity for support and for resources? How have I, by being silent about it, maybe missed opportunities that I could serve as a mentor for others? And so I'm on that journey now. But definitely, I believe that employers have to ask themselves, what would it mean if someone disclosed or didn't disclose? I mean, something as simple as, even though it may not be seen as a disability, if you just there's someone, if you disclose that you're pregnant on an interview, what does that do? So there's always these different types of levels of ability and things that people choose, particularly in a work environment, because of, unfortunately, just all of us have biases, and how those show up and play out, can be detrimental in many ways.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
to build on that same vein of bias, I personally try to disclose as often as I can when I am comfortable, for folks to, I guess, dismantle their own categorization of what disability is. Because anytime I have disclosed that I have two invisible disabilities, I get looked up and down and just like, what is wrong with you? What are you talking about? And it's like, well, just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? So I try to disclose for the sake of educating folks that disability comes in different forms and ways. It's not just a white cane or a wheelchair. It's so much more than that. Right. And it impacts us all differently. And something that I also try to have folks understand when I do disclose is to alleviate that sense of distrust or disbelief. because there have been some times where I have interacted with an individual who I have disclosed my disability to, and they don't believe me, or they don't trust that what I'm saying is actual fact, which is unfortunate. And it's like we say so much about how people need to be more mindful of how they show up when they do show that disbelief, because it's unfortunate to see people of color saying that they're being oppressed in the workplace and no one believes them. It's unfortunate to have students tell me that something unfortunate happened to them and that they're now a survivor and folks don't believe them. And as a person with a disability, it's very unfortunate for me to openly disclose to someone that I have a disability and I need accommodations and they don't believe me. So therefore, I disclose continuously to educate folks that disability comes in many forms, and you need to trust that what I'm saying is truth, because I'm disclosing it to you because it is my responsibility to develop those relationships with you out of trust, so that way we can further advance the work that is needed to accommodate people and people like me.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another panelist wanted to share the thought around, she just started the role that she's in and hasn't had time to disclose, but yet she's already experiencing with an invisible disability, the microaggressions associated with people, whether she chooses to disclose or not, she feels that people choose to talk, right? And so dealing with people reacting or thinking of making assumptions around the disability status with microaggressions. And also, she wants us to know that for folks with invisible disabilities, it's hard to manage because people sometimes believe this is a disposition that you have versus an actual disability. And that's what she wanted to share with us. I will tell you, we are down to our last minute. I certainly appreciate the panelists. This conversation could go on much longer. We did have one question from the audience around talking about disability cultural centers. Unfortunately, I don't think that we're going to be able to have time today in this panel, but hopefully at another point we'll be able to get to that. I want to thank you all for the fact that you showed up and that you spoke out and that you were able to come in and create a space where it challenged us to consider the ableist notions that we carry. It challenged us to consider how we interconnect disability and race, and it challenged us to do the work. There's a lot of work to be done, and we have a responsibility to do that work, not only for ourselves as practitioners, but for the many, many students that we serve. And so I'm grateful for your time, your energy, and your talent today. Thank you. And we appreciate ACPA for setting this up for us, and we appreciate our providers today who put this shindig, who put this on. And thank you again to the Coalition of Multicultural Affairs and the Coalition for Disability. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for showing up as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.